Thank you very much for inviting me to this symposium. Very interesting set of issues coming up here for me today. I will be talking about, the title of my talk is, my notes are on here, The Fusion and Fission of Civilization, Asia and Beyond. But the comments that I'll make here are not just about fusions of civilizations, but also of sub-civilization or sub-national groups, or national groups as well. The title comes, of course, when we talk about the fusion of civilizations, we're talking about the opposite of the clash of civilizations of Samuel Huntington. And this is not my term, but a recent paper in the current Foreign Affairs issue of Foreign Affairs, Kishore Mahbubani in Singapore and Larry Summers of the United States have a paper that's called The Fusion of Civilizations, the Case for Global Optimism. So this is something that is a different tone than we usually hear when we talk about civilizations and the problems and the pessimism we have. But I want to talk about here the idea of overlapping consensus for this session and point out that we're trying to think about overlapping consensus or fusion in a different context than we had before. This is not the same. We're not going back to the same kind of overlapping consensus building that we might have had 100 or 200 years ago or even 50 years ago. And this has to do with some comments that I'll make on the basis of what the Mahbubani and Summers paper had. According to Mahbubani and Summers, the bottom line for them is actually the world is actually coming together, not falling apart. And this is news to most people because we think of new nationalism, we think of conflict, but they're saying actually there's good news out there. And the idea, they point out many things that people in development routinely point out. Infant and maternal mortality is way down from what it was. We have 500 million people in the world at least have come out of extreme poverty over the past 30 years, mostly in this country, but around the world. There are massive points of development that have happened. Massive things the world's undergone to be very happy about, actually. They point out that dread diseases like polio are basically erased from the face of the earth. They also then say the major reason for this is the rise of the middle class that's happening in the world today. The rise of the middle class is something that is creates a new context for any kind of efforts we have to seek new overlapping consensus or to talk about the fusion of civilizations or whatever we want to talk about with regard to the relationship between groups. And Mahbubani and Summers go on to talk about what they call the March of Reason. I'm quoting them because we seldom would use such optimistic terms today. But they talk about the March of Reason that started with the Enlightenment and is allowing for people, middle-class people from the world, across the world, to come together in ways that would be unimaginable in a different previous age. Talks about the emergence of problem-solving cultures that have much more in common than they have in opposition to one another. So this is all part of the reason for optimism that Mahbubani and Summers point out. So we have this problem, the problem-solving cultures instead of irrational superstition or nationalism and all these things that we typically are so concerned about. Of course, Mahbubani and Summers note that if you're going to attribute this to the rise of the middle class, you also recognize there are tremendous costs with this developmental leap that we've made. There are tremendous costs in the form of environmental damage, global climate change, global warming that sets off refugee crises. We see all kinds of things that go along with the rise of wealth and middle class, the very fast using up of natural resources. Usually, though, we think of these costs as things that are unanticipated consequences or unintended consequences of the rise of the middle class. We say, yes, we have much to celebrate. The middle class has grown up around the world. It's caused a lot of damage, but we can fix those things. It's not necessary that that damage comes with the rise of the middle class. But what I want to talk about here today is there's another kind of correlate of the rise of the middle class that is built right into the rise of the middle class. It's part and parcel of the rise of the middle class. It's not something we can shed and go ahead with the rise of the middle class. What I have in mind can be found in a book. There's a 2008 book that's written by a guy named Bill Bishop. It's called The Big Sort. Not The Big Short. It doesn't have to do with market economies. It's called The Big Sort. Why? And the subtitle of the Bill Bishop's book, The Big Sort, is why the clustering of like-minded America is tearing us apart. And the point here is that with the rise of the middle class, so America is, you could say, example number one of the rise of the middle class. It's been doing it for 80, 90 years in the last century. But with the rise of the middle class, yes, we have new kinds of wealth, we have freedom, we have opportunities we'd never imagined, but we also are sorting ourselves out into like-minded communities in America. And this is a very big problem. This is the big sort, sorting ourselves out into like-minded groups of individuals. So along with wealth and freedom comes this tendency for people to isolate themselves, to sort themselves into isolated community, isolated groups. So we end up with a situation today in America where it's possible for a middle-class person or other people, but just talk about the middle class. It's possible as a middle-class American today, in fact, it's likely that you will meet people in your work and your place of religion, in your marketplace, in your neighborhood that think like you, because we've sorted ourselves into those groups. There's some extreme examples of this, but one way we see this is around elections. You probably know we have elections going on now, and they're maybe the most unusual elections I've ever seen in America. But we're seeing around elections once again. And so recently, the Washington Post columnist, E.J. Dionne, wrote an article where he said, you know, I live in Bethesda, Maryland. It's an upper middle class neighborhood, an upper middle class city. And I live in a city where nobody seems to know personally anybody who is a Trump supporter. We're all either Sanders or Clinton supporters. Now, of course, people have their opinions, that's fine. But usually we think, well, you could go out on the street, or you could go to your place of worship, or you could go to your work. And if I vote for Trump, I'll give you a hint, I won't. But if I vote for Trump, I could at least meet somebody who would vote for Clinton, and we could have a conversation. In America, because of the big sort into like-minded people, that's becoming less and less likely. And if you think about it, with the internet, with chat rooms and things like this, is extreme. It takes on an extreme form. You can live your whole life 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, talking only to those people with whom you agree. Maybe they're like you racially or gender, in terms of gender preference, or politically, but at least politically, and in terms of lifestyle, you can talk to only those people that think like you do. Another extreme example in America, about 10 years ago in Texas, and I'm not from Texas, but I won't make jokes about Texas, but Texas is a strange case for us. But in Texas, it's the home of a libertarian group. And so there's a group of people that got together and decided they would create a new subdivision, a new little town of new houses, and they would only let people live there who would vote for Ron Paul, who was a libertarian congressman from Texas. So now they're self-consciously creating a community that says you can be in this community only if you vote like I vote. And so usually it's not so overt as that. We do this naturally somehow. We're sorting ourselves out into these like-minded communities of like-minded people. And it's nothing completely new. And here's a good quote from Arthur Miller, a great playwright in America. In 2004 election, which was a George W. Bush election, Arthur Miller said, "How can the polls be neck and neck when I don't know one Bush supporter?" That is, we look at the polls and they say, here's Arthur Miller saying, how is it possible that you could have 50-50 split and I don't know anybody from that other 50%? Well, that's the point. It is all too possible in America. So you might say, well, that's American individualism for you. It's some kind of crazy idea they have in America about your individual rights, et cetera. But this is new. This has to do with the rise of the middle class. This didn't exist before. Even in my lifetime as a child, I knew people you didn't agree with them, you didn't have to like them, but they were in the opposite political party, and you saw them everywhere, at school and in your place of religion. When I went to the university, the same thing. But today we're seeing less and less of that. So this new trend of the big sort is associated with the rise of the middle class and the concerns we have about the middle class in America, the destruction of social capital, the destruction of civil society that Robert Putnam writes about when he talks about bowling alone, how people now like to be by themselves or to pick only those people they want to be with rather than join groups. Whereas civil society was a natural place for bringing different people together. With the decline of civil society, it's another way for the big sort to continue. So in a sense, you could say in America, within America, we have a kind of fission going on, a kind of breaking apart, a fission going on, instead of the fusion that Summers and Mahbubani are talking about. Well, if you think about that for a second, and I'm not I'm not a China expert at all, but from what my colleagues and students tell me, similar things you can see on the horizon in China. People increasingly can live away from those they don't agree with. It's possible to live, especially with the mass urbanization in China. People are coming together who think more similarly than they would when there was a big village and you have different kinds of people living together. So the paradox here is that on the one hand, there is something to what Summers and Mahbubani are talking about. There is a kind of a global middle class. People know each other. Probably many of you or some of your best colleagues are people from another society. You have similar aspirations for your kids, for your educational outcomes. So you have a fusion of in values and a lifestyle anyway. We do see this kind of global fusion. But at the same time, within societies, we're seeing this fission. And the paradox here is that the fission is exactly the kind of thing that could be a huge problem for the fusion. What I have in mind here is that the fission within societies can be very destructive when it comes to trying to think about a genuine fusion across societies. Why? Go back to American elections. Donald Trump, for example, today is appealing to people by saying, if you resent the upper middle class in America, you working class people, if you resent the upper middle class in America, so he's exacerbating, he's creating more of the fission, you don't even know them, they don't know you. But I'm going to appeal to you as working class voters, and I'm going to appeal to you on the basis of saying, you know, the problem for you is that the upper middle class people have all become global citizens, they've taken their factories abroad. It's a clear case where you can appeal to the worst sentiments, I think, of people, and by exacerbating the fission within a society and thereby threatening the fusion between societies. So coming back to what Mahbubani and Summers say, this is an optimistic picture. There are some indications that something like a global fusion of civilizations might be going on. But at the same time, there are danger signals in most societies where the middle class is emerging because of the big sort that's going on at the same time. So the fission within societies is creating a massive conflict or a danger to the fusion between societies. You have to ask, is this the source of the kind of new nationalistic appeal that somebody like Donald Trump is using in America, or the rise in the constant ongoing nationalism that we see in China as well? Different forms, but again, is the internal fission creating lack of possibilities or decreasing the likelihood of fusion across? So I don't want to just leave you with pessimistic note here, but just a couple of comments. So what do we do about this? First of all, obviously all societies, United States is the first, I can only speak for myself, but societies need to figure out a way to decrease the fission within society, and that means being very much more concerned with issues of income and wealth gap. This is the primary cause of a lot of these kinds of issues. But secondly, if you just think more locally at universities, if you look at American universities over the past 50 years have also increasingly kind of been characterized by a fission. The elite universities, now the top 50 universities in the United States, are almost all private universities. people want to go to those private universities, and they're not going to the state universities, which were great universities in the past and still are great, where they would be more likely to meet people other than those like themselves. So we're kind of creating more of a like-minded community within universities unless we have policies that can call that into question. My university is working on this. I understand in China you also have it, increasing the top universities are appealing more and more to the elite people and not from all the rural areas. So it's a common problem. I think Mahbubani and Summers are to be congratulated on on finding something that's a reason for optimism, for finding something that we could call maybe the budding fusion of civilizations. But I would caution us to recognize it's occurring in a new context with the rise of the middle class, and there's a paradox built into that we're all going to have to deal with if we don't want to go back to an old form of nationalism. So thank you very much.